Konstmusik road trip. This is me, this is my website, and for those of you who would like a copy of this, please write down my website. You can contact me, and I'd be happy to email you a copy of this. I have a lot of links at the end. Here's the United States. We've got Hawaii, we've got Alaska, and we don't have any of the territories, Puerto Rico, American Samoa. And here are the cities that we're all very intimately familiar with. The giant metropolis of New York and Los Angeles, the centers of musical life in the United States, as well as Miami, the beach city. And I'm from way up here. I'm from the middle of nowhere. Grand Forks, a place you might only be familiar with if you've seen the movie Fargo or the series. That's where I'm from, and that's my people. And so I think that actually helps me to talk to you today because my musical experiences have taken me literally all over the country. I played with an orchestra out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and played, I was a bassist, played with a choir in tours of just about every state in the United States. And then from there I moved to the giant university, Indiana University, and studies with Swedish composer Sven David Sandström eventually got me a project here, and I ended up being hired at Gotland Composer School. And I think what's really great about this is we see kind of I think when it comes to music, we have an underserved area, which is to say, Grand Forks, North Dakota, out in the middle of nowhere. We have one of the giant university towns where we have these universities of 40, 50, 60,000 students. And then we have the large metropolitan areas. So I want to, when we're talking about ensembles, and my presentation is mostly going to be directed towards music creators, that is to say composers, performance artists, electroacoustic musicians, but also those of you who have your ensembles. And out in Boston, we've got the Boston Modern Orchestra Project. The landscape, just like in pop music, with the advent of streaming, with the loss of revenue from CD sales, the classical music world in the United States is also rapidly changing, both in ways that leave me kind of deeply pessimistic about the future of the art form that I love, but also in ways that leave me really excited. And one of those is the advent of a lot more groups that are dedicated to the performance of new music. I mean, trying to get on a program, we had a really big controversy this summer in the art music world, konstmusikvärld, where we had the kvinnliga avhoppning av svenska tonsättare. They did this great survey where they found out that there was more music of Brahms performed last year. It was the most performed composer by minutes of all the music institutions that receive public funds. There was more Brahms performed than living composers. And the situation is even worse in the United States for us who are writing new orchestra scores. But Boston Modern Orchestra Project is dedicated only to the music of living composers. In the case of Gunther Schuller, here pictured here, he just passed away, so it was a concert in memory of him. And I think this is a great site. I have this picture of the site, and I want to bring your attention up here to support BMOP, because when we're understanding where the money is coming from in the United States for composers, for ensembles, it's radically different than in Sweden. But we've got, Chinnery Ung recording here of and a list of some of their performances. Public funding or the lack thereof is the fundamental difference between konstmusik in the United States and in most of Europe, including Sweden. Here we have public funding for arts institutions, whether it's, Konserthuset right here, the big blue building where the music money from I suppose you would say the federal budget, Musikverket, Konstnärsnämnden, Kulturrådet, all of these institutions are providing monies to ensembles to put on concerts, like the Sound of Stockholm Festival that I helped produce at Kulturhuset. They're providing money for ensembles to commission living composers, and they're providing money for projects like musically exploratory projects. The United States has literally none of that. Our public money through the National Endowment of the Arts, it's so small a budget that it's laughable. I believe it's even smaller. It's much smaller overall than the Swedish budget. We're talking about a country that's 35 times larger in population. So it's private philanthropy. It's donors that are providing everything from Metropolitan Opera to the little Grand Forks Symphony in my hometown is supported by ticket sales and it's supported by donations, whether it's rich people, whether it's companies who want to be able to look good and say we donate to these ensembles, or whether it's just people leaving small amounts every year, which is tax deductible. So that's the major difference, and that has a big effect on, for example, the programming of the major American orchestras. There's just less new music. They have to bend to the will of rich donors who want to sit there and fall asleep to Brahms, right? Institutions and ensembles are also more reliant on ticket sales. They have to follow the interests of these foundations that are providing them with large sums of money. And there is no national kulturpolitik to speak of, which is in of itself a kulturpolitik. We're seeing, a lot of the kind of right-wing culture wars that began in the 80s and reached ahead in the 90s just cut apart the arts budget in the United States. So is there any good news? Well, I think expectations and preparation have to be different. For commission money for composers, there's a question mark after that. And I'll talk about that later. And then travel, lodging, and fees. But there's an advantage, and I think that if you end up organizing a tour, if you end up putting pieces in place for a residency with an ensemble there, if you end up getting performances, Svensk Musik, which is in connection with STIM, can provide travel grants, as well as Konstnärsnämnd and Kulturrådet. And as project funding and tour funding comes in, some of that's available for bands as well. So where is the money for musicians? The number one financial refuge is universities. I'm going to spend a lot of my time today talking about universities, the ways that composers here can samarbeta, cooperate with institutions in the United States, because we're talking about over 3,000 four-year universities and colleges. Each of these universities, just about, the vast majority of them, they have some sort of budget for bringing in acts from other states, bringing in acts locally, bringing in acts internationally, and I'll talk about that more in detail. They have music offerings including bands, choirs, orchestras, I write choirs again, early music ensembles, new music ensembles, and there's a whole list. My college had a gamelan, which is an Indonesian percussion orchestra. They had taiko drums. So the list of music offerings, and more importantly perhaps, the infrastructure is really there. These universities very often have very large endowments. If we're talking about Yale, that's running into the billions of dollars. And some of that money is put into buildings, black box theaters, clubs in the school, concert venues of many different types. And of course, there are positions for musicians: composers, performers, conductors, musicologists, early musicians, electronic musicians. They have electronic music studios. Many of my friends that I studied with, this is the path that they were on. I'm going to get my master's, I'm going to get my doctorate, I'm going to get the university gig, and I'll set for life. Unfortunately, that landscape is also changing. But even still, some universities, they can commission composers. Some of them have foundations. University of Louisville has the prestigious Grawemeyer Award, which is the largest cash award for composers on a yearly basis, which, interestingly enough, a year ago was won by a Swedish composer, relatively unknown, Juro Zivkovic, who I have the pleasure of knowing. These universities can invite composers and musicians for residencies. I myself will be on at least two next year, and they can pay for visiting ensembles and musicians to give concerts, and they can pay for bands. So if they're poor in arts funding, they're rich in performance opportunity. We're talking about a giant country with everything from small towns in agricultural areas like where I'm from, university cities like Bloomington where I studied, the large cities around the country. And in those cities, there are over 1,200 orchestras in the United States. As of 2007, 117 with what we would call a professional budget. So there is possibility there, and if you're interested in finding out what these orchestras are, you can go to the League of American Orchestras site. They also have a conference every year where you can meet a lot of the people behind these orchestras. And so I think if there's an opportunity that might be worth looking at travel grants if you're a composer, it's looking at seeing if you can attend some of these conferences I'll talk about, because this is where you can, like today, you can meet a whole lot of people. And if we think about 1,200 orchestras and we think about the 300 active composer members of Föreningen Svenska Tonsättare, how many would that be? That would be enough for everybody to get 4 orchestra performances if all of these orchestras were to perform one piece by a Swedish composer. So how to get performed by these orchestras, I think, is it's a difficult thing. I'll be honest there, and it comes down to the fact that in the classical music world, it's a very small world, and it's still personal relationships that win out. And having a conductor champion is probably the best way to get performed broadly in the United States. I use the example here of Anders Heldag, who's one of Sweden's most performed, most prestigious living composers, who just had last year was the featured composer at Kompositören on Tonsättare. And he had Esa-Pekka Salonen, who has, among other orchestras, conducted LA Phil, San Francisco, and who's taken Helborg's music to New York, performed it all over the world, and helped Helborg get the position of composer in residence there at the New York Philharmonic. Why do I bring that up? I guess because if you do have conductor connections that are working at one of these many orchestras in the US and you haven't sent them your scores, I would urge you to do so. The second possibility is to enter call for scores in contests. And when I show what's happening in the chamber world, I'll talk a little bit more about these calls for scores. And finally, you can attend a conference such as Conductors Guild, where the members of the Conductors Guild every year gather to talk about issues in their field, and there's possibilities to set up booths there and get scores in the hands of hundreds of conductors. Okay. Professional freelance chamber ensembles, despite not having state funding, there are certain groups with international profile that can manage to play full-time. And then a lot of these groups supplement that income with university positions, teaching, och så vidare. And in Chicago, the International Contemporary Ensemble, who are also resident in New York, is a good example of one of these kind of mixed chamber ensembles that is prominent in the United States. And out in San Francisco, the famous Kronos Quartet, which since the recordings of George Crumb's Black Angels back in the 70s, have really been at the avant-garde of string quartet performance, have been heard in many films, have performed with diverse artists throughout the world. If we look at the ICE website here, they've got the ICE Lab, and it's one, I think, the more exciting new formats of composer collaboration that's happening in the world. And what they do is they invite several, in this case, I think it was 9 or 10 composers in the year 2013 for ICE Lab collaborations. And so Anna Torvaldsdottir from Iceland, Sasha Siem, Felipe Lara from Brazil, and several more composers all around the world were invited to work with ICE in intensive workshop situations, developing new works and culminating in performance. So instead of just a commission, they're getting to know composers, the composers are getting to know the groups. And again, you can look up there in the top right, and we've got support. Even this group needs donations to help support their activity. Kronos has 50 for the future. Kronos Quartet is investing in the future of their art form by commissioning 50 new works in the next 5 years. Or excuse me, 10 per year for 5 years from all over the world. And they've only started this project, so I would urge you to keep this in your opportunities listing, keep it on your calendar as a possibility. Most of the work that I do, instead of, I'm a relatively young composer, and so I'm not working a whole lot with the top groups yet. But I do work quite a bit with local nonprofit groups. So these are in smaller cities, in university cities, in large cities, but it's a young group. And down in Spartanburg, South Carolina, you've got Tree Fall's new music series. And if you have an ensemble, if you've got a band that's doing really new art performance type of stuff, these are the types of series where you might be able to get on a concert and they will take care of the marknadsföring, PR. They've got their built-in audience. They've got their venues. Again, there's the donate button. And sometimes they have a call for scores. And many of these ensembles have on their website a call for scores. In this case, Treefall is looking for new works for a piano trio, and they detail the requirements. They're looking for a composer that, in this case is under 38, open to composers anywhere in the world. They'll be giving preference to unknown composers, those who come from traditionally unrepresented groups. So it's not a stretch to think that a composer active in Kiruna, Sweden, or wherever would be able to get a performance with them. So I think in general, connecting with American musicians, and I suppose this would extend to connecting with universities, to trying to doing the kind of boots on the ground hustling to get yourself performances, whether it's as a band, whether it's as a nutida kammarensemble. I give myself this advice all the time. I come from a place where, it's a little jantelag, and I have to tell myself not to be shy. You find a university on the map that's kind of along the place that you want to take your tour, and you give the music office a call, and you find out who you need to talk about booking concerts at the university. These are the types of steps that are really important to take, because remember, as a Swedish musician, you're by default very interesting. You approach Freya Quartet in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and you say, hey, I admire the work you're doing there. My friend Matthew Peterson says you're a good group. I've got this piece. Would you look at it? And they're going to be very flattered that you found them. They're going to be glad that you thought of them, that you follow the work they're doing. And so I think if the approach is right, even if you're going out of the blue, even if you're using just a mutual connection, you're going to be interesting, you're not going to come across as pushy, and they're not going to blackball you for the rest of your life. What's the worst that could happen? And I think finding the right fit, especially for composers, is very important. At the end of the day, I'm going to give a list of ensembles that are active in different parts of the country. And I think it would be, if you're going to do your research and find a group that is on the same musical wavelength, find a scene that where the musical personalities can meet. If you're lucky enough to get a commission from one of these groups, FST has their new Arvodets rekommendationer. This is the guidelines for if you want to commission music of a specific length, specific information. Föreningen Svenska Tonsättare wants to help and make sure that you get an appropriate rate. Not only so that man kan försörja sig på eget skapande, but also so that you don't undercut everyone else. But in the United States, the situations financially are so different. Here, if you're getting a commission from an institution, one of the orchestras that receives public money, you have to get a fair rate. But if you're getting a commission from a small ensemble in the United States, they might not be able to offer you even half of what you would be getting here. And so you have to weigh it. Is the opportunity to write for a new ensemble, to be played in a new place, is it worth it? And no one can make that decision for you. But if you get commissioned by a major ensemble, I have the link here where New Music USA, which is one of the new music associations, they give their recommendation for what you should be looking for different works of different length, whether everything from solo pieces, electroacoustic music, to opera and orchestra. University Chamber Series, I think, is something really interesting, and I come back again and again to universities, and it's because the universities in the United States have just a whole different, it's just an entirely different situation than the state-run universities here. And I think that there is lots of opportunities. So if there's one thing you remember from the presentation today for all of you, it's that don't go to sleep on this source of possible touring income, this source of possible performance and exposure. I saw a lot of bands. I saw Black Eyed Peas I think 3 years ago before they had their big annoying hit at St. Olaf College. You know, they were coming through and it was a good show. They put on a really good show. I think they played that Let's Get Retarded song. And it's just an example that they were working that circuit. They were working the university circuit. They were going to Little St. Olaf College in Podunk, Minnesota years before they were, you know, doing the Super Bowl halftime show and being in commercials and things like this. I've got Boulder, Colorado. University of Colorado Boulder is a really cool university. I played a concert there back in 2004. And they've got a Pendulum New Music series that I think is really enviable. And I think the guy's name there is Snowden, the composition faculty who created that. I know, ironic, right? Like Edward Snowden. But no relation, I don't think. And they've got here Kronos Quartet, David Harrington working with, I can only assume, a student quartet. But these type of series, if you can find them, they'll bring in composers, they'll bring in ensembles. So back to their budgets, they've got budgets set aside for concerts by visiting and touring musicians. They've got budgets for commissioning fees to composers. Myself, I think I've received, 4 or 5 commissions from universities. They'll pay guest composers and musicians to teach, seminars, stuff like that. Great way to meet new musicians, great way to expand your network. Touring the United States, you know, in addition to playing bars, playing concert halls, you've got universities and colleges, art museums, local series. For those of you that have bands and want to tour, you find where these big state universities are. I've got a list of them at the end of the presentation. Indiana University, there was the Bluebird, really great venue, paid really great gauge. There's an assortment of bars that will be able, you know, to pay a good rate. You've got on-campus venues in a lot of the smaller colleges and universities. So it's just a matter of finding what's out there and then doing your research. Now with all the great websites, you can not only find out what the different localer are that they have there, but you can also find out who you contact about booking. Opera, this is my baby. I like writing chamber opera. I like writing for singers. I like writing stories on the stage. And there's a whole lot happening right now in chamber opera in the United States. Chamber opera is opera for a mindre besättning of players and singers. And I think some of the most exciting experimental things that are happening in the United States right now are happening in chamber opera. In general, I would say that the new music scene's a little more conservative than here, although it's, I think, also a lot more diverse. And Beth Morrison Projects is really at the forefront of what's been happening in the last 10 years. Here she's got a list of 6 of the different pieces that her company is producing, mostly in the New York area, but also in LA. And I think they've even taken some performances over to the United Kingdom. I think it's only a matter of time before we see something in Norden by Beth Morrison Projects. But again, we see this nice little support button in the upper right. I should get one of those from my website, just support, where people can leave me money. But again, I think there's something that is a little bit, I think a lot of groups have responded very creatively to the challenge of presenting artworks, you know, pieces that people are supposed to come and listen, and finding an audience for that, which is not easy. It's not easy. It's hard enough, I think, to find an audience if you're creating dance music. If you're creating music, you know, that can be sold as a 3-minute song, that's hard enough. And then if you're presenting, you know, a 2-hour chamber opera on a difficult subject, they've done a really great job. And it's, I think, a really encouraging sign that people that, you know, this type of music is magical, and people are drawn to it. I have the good fortune of working with Fort Worth Opera, and Fort Worth Opera is also at the forefront. They're one of the kind of old institutions that has adapted to present opera, new opera, in exciting ways. And here is JFK by David T. Little, libretto by Royce Vavrick. Little is, I think, a 36, 37-year-old composer. I'm insanely jealous of him. He gets just great commissions. He's getting stuff all around the world, and hopefully that's where I'm at in 5-6 years. But JFK, it's an opera about the night before Kennedy died, and that's their big new grand opera that they're presenting. But Fort Worth Opera has a festival called Fort Worth Opera Frontiers, and it's a sort of contest or call for scores for a workshop, and I ended up winning this 2 years ago. And as a result, I'm going to have a piece produced by them in concert with several other groups, up in Milwaukee with Milwaukee Skylight, in New York with Symphony Space. So these calls for scores that groups have for prizes, festivals, workshops, residencies, chance to collaborate in a laboratory setting like ICE Lab, it's really worth applying, and I think now that the FST has a opportunities listing, composersite.com that I list at the bottom has an opportunities listing, and if you have a band or you work electronically, you should go to this site anyway, because there's starting to be a lot of cross-genre type calls where they're looking for bands, where they're looking for recordings, where they're looking for people to work with film. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. I'm on their mailing list, so I just get an email every week with the new opportunities and the expiring opportunities. And so if you're not on this list, just get on it, get an email, check it out. When I have something that works, I send it off. I think that the negative part about the United States is that when you have such a limited, when you don't have public funding for the arts, some of the groups start to limit opportunities to composers born in the United States, composers living in the United States. It's exclusionary. There's a lot that have age limits. I suppose you could call that kind of ageist, but it's the reality. But fortunately, some awards have these special categories. I've even won some now for international composers, which is kind of fun. Third Angle Ensemble. And of course, these are free to submit electronically. When I started out as a composer 10 years ago, I'm burning CDs all the time. I'm spending all the money I made playing as postage. Nowadays, you put it on Dropbox, takes you 10 minutes and you're done. So whether, you're talking to a university and you're going to send them a demo to see if you can get a gig, it's just easier than it's ever been. Electroacoustic music, composers of computer music, sound installations. I've got Alaska on the map. I really wanted to get Alaska. My uncle lived in Alaska 14 years. I spent a lot of time there. But I never got to take a pilgrimage to the place where you go to listen, which I think is one of the coolest museum installations I've ever heard of. Composer John Luther Adams, what he did is he's got this, you can see this wall of light. And as it says here, the ever-changing musical ecosystem gives voice to the rhythms of daylight and darkness, the phases of the moon, the seismic vibrations of the earth, and the dance of the aurora borealis, Norrskön, in real time. So he's got a computer program that's hooked to kind of different electronic instruments, and he's getting input from the National Meteorological Center so that what's happening underground in Alaska, what's happening with the sun flares, temperature, the daylight, is affecting not only the music that you're hearing, but also the lights that you're seeing. But it's one of many examples of installations that you find in the many art museums on campuses and in cities across the United States. So if you work mainly in electronic music, if you make sound installations, it's really worth looking up where the different museums are. Another favorite, of course, is Rothko Chapel in Houston. Many museums in Houston, a lot of great installations that I've seen there. And of course, finally, participating in a conference. International Computer Music Conference is held very often in the United States, although it moves around the world. SHAMA, Society of Electronic Acoustic Music in the United States. Coming to choral and vocal, I sing in Gustav Sjökvist Kammerchor. I love singing, I always have. And way out in the Pacific Northwest, you have one of the more recent choirs that's come around, Esoterics in Seattle. Esoterics is kind of what I would call like a professional amateur group, where they're doing professional recordings, they're commissioning composers, they have a high profile, but the singers I don't think are paid very much. And here they've got a competition, you know, the 2015-16 competition. You're going to get a, you know, $1,000 in airfare to attend the premiere. They have an international commission, a national commission, a young composers commission with no entry fee. So I find this really inspiring that, you know, despite things being really hard for these groups, they're finding it in their budgets to create commissioning fees and continue the tradition of choral music. So another great opportunity for composers. Choral and Music U in the U.S., a lot like Sweden, there are a lot of amateur and educational groups. The amateur groups, like the amateur groups here, can be pretty advanced, especially groups like the Esoterics. You get everything from community groups that you know aren't that great to professional level amateur groups. And then again, the university and college ensembles. Just about every university is going to have at least one choir. I went to Indiana University School of Music with 1,500 students. I think they had 13 choirs, including a new music choir. And so I think, you know, if you want to find out and how you can get music in the hands of these choirs, you know, personal connections are always best. There are, you know, as a wealth, there's a Swedish choral tradition that exports conductors to the overseas, utlandet. There's a Swedish choral and Nordic choral tradition where composers like Sandström, Rautavaara, Ole Jalo in Norge, they're widely performed in the United States. And so again, another reason that you as a Swedish composer would be interesting to them. And finally, there are conferences. American Choral Directors Association. It's huge. I played my first concert at Walt Disney Hall as a bassist with the St. Olaf Choir, works by Bach and Eric Whitaker, and hundreds of singers and conductors at the Chorus America and American Choral Directors Association. So if you're a composer of choral music, if you write for choir, that's one of the best ways is to set up a table, set up a booth at one of these conferences. And I would actually be interested to know if Svensk Musik has ever set up at one of these conferences. And finally, wind ensemble and band. We've got the great Stockholms Blåsarsymfoniker in this city, and there's a few other really great pro groups in the country. Gotlands Musiken comes to mind. And if you've written for one of these ensembles, it's challenging to get performances in this region. There simply are not that many blåssymfoniker. But if you get it into the hands of a university conductor in the United States, if you get it to some of these really great college bands, that's where you can get performances. Here we got the University of Northern Florida. And you can see from the players, great facilities. You know, they've got all the percussion instruments you could want. And so it's just a matter of going to a conference or mailing a conductor and getting scores in their hands. And of course, the military bands, like here, are among the only professional bands in the country. I have friends who make their whole living writing for bands. You know, they get performed by these military bands who are top-notch, and they get invited to different universities. They get commissions by consortiums of universities, that is, these universities band together to pay $50,000 for John Mackey to write another symphony for band. And niche composers, of course, these are composers who write mostly for one kind of music, whether it's choral music or band music. I'd say the majority of full-time professional composers in the United States have kind of found a niche. And usually that's writing for, you know, some kind of educational ensemble like band or choir. In summary, the good, there's a lot of opportunities for performance. It's a huge country. There are a lot of people, a lot of places to go, a lot of people to meet. And with every new person that you meet, there's a possibility for a new collaboration for new work. The bad, there are the funding difficulties. Uncertainty whether you can get a commission as a composer. And these groups rarely commission without some sort of help. And the ugly that there's this sort of musical nationalism where a lot of the calls for scores have some sort of begränsning where it's only open to US residents or citizens. But you have this advantage. We have this great system where you can apply for verksamhetsbidrag i olika former. Here's my map from the last 2 years. And, you know, I'm very young, and so I've been at this for about 6-7 years, and really I'm coming from the place that a lot of Swedish composers would, where I didn't have a professional network in the United States outside of a few really great players that I met while I was a student at Indiana University. But somehow I've managed to kind of parlay that and a little bit of good luck and a little bit of hustling, as I like to call it, into getting a lot of performances, really across the entire country. How did I do it? Well, I got commissions from some bands. These university ensembles. These were former classmates of mine that ended up conducting groups and called my name. And I was happy to answer. I wrote a niche piece. I wrote a piece, I got commissioned to write a piece for a Christmas concert. And as so often happens, you know, we can never predict what our hit's going to be. And I ended up having this kind of orchestra piece that gets performed a dozen or a couple dozen times a year. That ends up being a really nice STIM check. I won contests. I got a piece performed by the Minnesota Orchestra, one of the top orchestras. I won a contest with Third Angle Ensemble out in Seattle and a group in New York. I won a few calls for scores for these groups in New York and Florida, electronic music group in New York. And of course, the musician who played that piece with north-south configuration or consonants, I guess it is, in New York, she kept the piece. She performs it all the time. My violin solo. Fort Worth Opera, I took part in a festival. You know, I kept track of my opportunities listings, and I sent a piece in. They invited me, paid my airfare, got to meet, you know, a bunch of great singers, and ended up getting, you know, interest in producing the work that I'd written. Former classmates took a piece of mine on tour, play it all the time. And University of North Dakota, Illinois Wesleyan University, they invited me for residencies where they performed, you know, a whole concert of my stuff. They took my pieces on tour. Here's a list of links I have to festivals: Mata, Bang on a Can, Fast Forward Austin, Cabrillo Carlsbad, New Iamo. These are new and electronic music festivals. Music associations and conferences that I referenced, opportunities listings, and some grants. There are a couple grants here that would be interesting for all of you, especially the American Scandinavian Foundation. They're interested in, these are like Swedish Americans, Scandinavian Americans, who are interested in keeping close cultural ties with Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. And as a result, there's money available. There's money available for travel. There's money available for Swedish bands to come to the United States. So check it out. They also have links to other Nordic American foundations that you might be eligible for. And if you're an artist or a performer, Swedish Fulbright Commission pays for artists to do projects with institutions in the United States. That's the grant that took me here to Sweden. It'll pay for Swedish students, läkarstudenter, juriststudenter, med flera forskare to do a year in the United States, studying at a university, working with an institution. And finally, a select list of music ensembles and major conservatories by location. I list here the really big state schools and the really top music schools, but this is just a small fraction of these thousands of universities in the United States. And with that, I guess I've got about 5 minutes if there are any questions. I see a few composers in the hall today. If you're interested in general about my knowledge of, you know, American geography and touring locations, I'm also very happy to help you with that. Here's my email and my website. Thank you. Any questions? Jag skulle säga så här att egentligen det beror på vilken sorts musik man vill göra. Men jag känner så många folk som skulle kalla sig för tonsättare som är liksom konstmusik, elektronisk musik tonsättare som jobbar ingenting med partitur och notation, den gammaldags stilen jag använder. Så jag skulle säga att själva skapandet, själva musiken, det är det som är viktigt. Och när det gäller att just söka för möjligheter med orkester och kör och sådana saker. And here I'm jumping back and forth languages. I guess I would just say that if you find the right group and they think you're an interesting artist, I don't think there's anything getting in the way of finding a way to work together. Och jag tycker desto mer och mer konstmusikvärlden expanderar, då kommer det in i området och överlappar med popområdet jättemycket. Så igen, jag tänker det är bara den där konstnärlig träff att grupper gör som är viktigt. Så jag tycker inte det medium som... It's not the medium that someone works with that's really important in the end. But if you're working with a group that only plays from scores, that's what they're going to do. But I think there are some orchestras that would be interested in taking a big risk and trying something completely different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but if you have to submit scores, is it sufficient to let the program do it for you? Is it like you can do it in the program, let it translate it into scores, and then like send it as the program makes it?
Well, if they're judging things by the score quality, they're going to look at a lot of things like the craftsmanship of the notation and the clarity. So I think if you were able to get across the music in that translation process, if it was the way you wanted it to be, but I mean, when we're working with if you're converting to MIDI information, which is then converting a score, there are lots of problems in that translation process. As long as you're aware of those, I don't see any reason you couldn't do that. So I think that groups that are just wanting a recording, groups that just want a sound file, like Circuit Bridges, it's an electronic music opportunity. You know, I just sent them I had a quad piece, and I just sent them a stereo reduction. And then from that, they chose my piece for a program. I send them the quad files. I think I wrote that piece in Digital Performer, maybe it was Pro Tools. So a lot of opportunities ask for just the sound file. Någon annan fråga? Jag vill tacka er, jag är tonsättare. Jag är inte van att stå framför fina folk som är så många av er är liksom riktigt stagecraft and can work a crowd. Så om jag var lite awkward här uppe, jag ber om ursäkt. Men jag är glad för chansen att kunna prata med er och jag hoppas att jag gav er någonting ni kan använda. Tack igen.
Too humble.
Tack Jerka.